In 218 BC, a Carthaginian general achieved what Romans thought impossible, crossing the Alps with 37 war elephants and 30,000 troops in just 16 days. His name was Hannibal, and he was African. But he's just one of 10 extraordinary warriors from the continent whose stories have been deliberately erased from mainstream history books. These men and women didn't just fight battles, they revolutionized warfare, built empires that spanned continents, and defended their people against impossible odds. From the queen who commanded 20,000 soldiers across 16th century Nigeria to the Nubian pharaoh who ruled Egypt and fought the mighty Assyrians, these are the African military geniuses who shaped world history. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you understand African history and military strategy. The historical accounts presented here are based on extensive archaeological evidence, primary source documents, and scholarly research. Some details remain debated among historians due to the limited survival of written records from certain periods. Where multiple sources conflict, we've presented the most widely accepted interpretations while noting areas of historical uncertainty. In the rolling hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal, a military revolution was taking place that would change southern African warfare forever. Shaka Kasenzangakona didn't just fight wars. He fundamentally transformed how they were conducted. The traditional Zulu warfare of the early 1800s was almost ceremonial. Warriors would stand 35 to 45 meters apart, each armed with a long throwing spear called an assegai and a tall shield. They'd hurl spears at each other from this safe distance, easily dodging the slow, arcing projectiles. Battles ended when both sides had thrown all their spears, typically with no casualties. Shaka looked at this ritualized dance of war and saw opportunity for devastating innovation. Archaeological evidence shows he revolutionized three key elements of warfare. First, the weapon. He replaced the long throwing assegai with the iklwa, a short stabbing spear with a broad, sword-like blade designed for close-quarters combat. The name iklwa comes from the sucking sound it made when withdrawn from an enemy's body. Second, the tactics. Shaka developed the legendary Impondo Zankomo, or Horns of the Beast formation. The center, called the chest, would engage the enemy head-on, while two flanking forces, the horns, would encircle and trap the opponent. Behind them, the loins, veteran reserves, waited to exploit any breakthrough. Third, the conditioning. Shaka banned sandals among his warriors to toughen their feet, instituted brutal training regimens, and fed his armies a diet of beef and cereal porridge that required constant cattle raids, turning warfare into economic necessity. But here's what most people don't know. Shaka didn't invent these innovations. Recent archaeological research and oral histories reveal that short stabbing spears were already being used by various groups, including the Mthethwa and Ndwandwe peoples. What made Shaka remarkable was his ability to systematize and perfect these existing techniques into a coherent military revolution. Contemporary European observers were astounded by the discipline of Zulu armies. The speed and coordination of their movements, their ability to cover enormous distances, and their devastating effectiveness in battle created a military machine that could defeat forces many times their size. By the time of Shaka's assassination in 1828, the Zulu kingdom had become the dominant power in southern Africa. In the 16th century West Africa, while Europe was just beginning to explore the world beyond its borders, an African queen was building one of the most formidable military machines the continent had ever seen. Queen Amina of Zazzau commanded not just respect, but absolute dominance over a territory larger than many European kingdoms. Archaeological evidence still visible today tells her story. The Ganuar Amina, Amina's walls, stretch across northern Nigeria, massive fortifications she ordered built around every city she conquered. These weren't mere defenses. They were statements of power, technological marvels that required sophisticated engineering and massive labor coordination. Born around 1533 as Aminatu to King Nikotao of Zazao, she was groomed for leadership from childhood. But what set Amina apart wasn't just her royal birth, it was her revolutionary approach to warfare. Historical sources describe her leading an army of 20,000 foot soldiers and 1,000 cavalry troops, personally commanding them from the front lines. Amina's military innovations were groundbreaking. She introduced metal armor to her armies, iron helmets and chainmail that gave her forces a crucial advantage over opponents using traditional leather protection. Her strategists developed new formation tactics optimized for the open savanna warfare of West Africa. Most importantly, she understood that controlling trade routes was the key to sustainable power. Under her leadership, Zazao controlled the vital trans-Saharan trade routes, connecting the gold fields of the south with the Mediterranean markets of the north. One contemporary account describes a single tribute payment to her treasury: 40 eunuchs and 10,000 kola nuts. This economic warfare, using trade and tribute to fund military expansion, allowed her to sustain 34 years of almost continuous campaigning. Her conquests stretched from the traditional Hausa heartland to regions as far south as the Niger-Benue confluence. The famous 19th century Sokoto Caliph Muhammad Bello wrote of her achievements, "She waged war in the Hausa lands and took them all, so that the men of Katsina and the men of Kano brought her tribute." But Amina's true genius lay in understanding that military conquest meant nothing without economic and administrative control. She didn't just defeat enemies, she integrated their territories into a functioning empire, standardizing trade practices, establishing permanent garrisons, and creating the administrative infrastructure necessary to govern a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. 27 centuries ago, in the desert south of Egypt, a civilization arose that would challenge the greatest empires of the ancient world. The Kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Napata near the fourth cataract of the Nile, produced warrior kings who didn't just fight Egypt, they conquered it, ruled it, and revitalized it. Taharqa, the greatest of these Nubian pharaohs, ruled an empire that stretched from the heart of Sudan to the Mediterranean Sea. But his most remarkable military achievement isn't found in African soil, it's recorded in the Hebrew Bible. In 701 BC, the Assyrian Empire under Sennacherib was systematically destroying the kingdoms of the Levant. Jerusalem, under King Hezekiah, faced annihilation. The Assyrian war machine had already devastated 46 fortified cities of Judah. But then, according to biblical and Assyrian sources, something unprecedented happened. An African army marched north to challenge the most powerful military force in the world. 2 Kings, chapter 19 records. Now Sennacherib received a report that Tirhakah, the Kushite king of Egypt, was marching out to fight against him. This Tirhakah was Taharqa, who at the time was likely a prince commanding forces for the reigning pharaoh Shebitku. The archaeological evidence supports this dramatic intervention. Assyrian annals confirm that Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem was abandoned, his army withdrew, and his plans for total conquest of the Levant were permanently derailed. While the exact details remain debated, the intervention of Kushite forces fundamentally altered the course of ancient Middle Eastern history. But Taharqa's military achievements extended far beyond this single campaign. As pharaoh, he commanded the most technologically advanced army of his era. Excavations at el-Kurru reveal that Kushite horses were considered the finest in the ancient world, superior even to Assyrian cavalry mounts. The Nubians had perfected the integration of cavalry, infantry, and archery units into mobile combined arms forces that could outmaneuver the static formations of their enemies. Taharqa's building program reveals the economic foundation of his military power. His monuments at Karnak, Kawa, and Jebel Barkal demonstrate a kingdom with resources that dwarfed most ancient states. His inscriptions describe giving large amounts of gold to temples, resources that translated directly into military capability. When the Assyrians finally conquered northern Egypt in 671 BC, Taharqa retreated south, regrouped, and launched a counteroffensive that retook Memphis and the Delta. It took repeated Assyrian invasions to finally drive him back to Nubia. Even in defeat, he had demonstrated that African military engineering could challenge the greatest armies of the ancient world. The Alps had never been crossed by an army. Every military expert knew it was impossible. The mountains were too high, the passes too narrow, the winter weather too brutal, and certainly no one had ever attempted it with war elephants. But in 218 BC, a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca looked at those impossible Alps and saw opportunity. What followed was one of the most audacious military maneuvers in human history, a campaign that brought the Roman Republic to the brink of extinction. Recent archaeological breakthroughs have finally solved the 2,200-year-old mystery of Hannibal's route. Biostratigraphic analysis of peat bogs near the Col de la Traversette Pass revealed massive soil disturbance and unique concentrations of Clostridia bacteria associated with the digestive tracts of thousands of animals. The evidence suggests that Hannibal's 30,000 troops, 15,000 horses, and 37 African war elephants crossed through this treacherous 7,700-foot-high pass in just 16 days. But the Alps crossing, remarkable as it was just the beginning. Hannibal's true genius lay in his revolutionary approach to warfare itself. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, facing a Roman army of 86,000 men with only 50,000 of his own, Hannibal executed what military historians consider the perfect tactical battle. He deliberately weakened his center, allowing the Romans to push forward while his flanks held firm. As the Roman advance became overextended, Hannibal's forces executed a double envelopment, the famous pincer movement that surrounded the entire Roman army. When the slaughter ended, 70,000 Romans lay dead, including 80 senators, 29 military tribunes, and the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Contemporary Roman sources, despite their bias against Carthage, couldn't deny Hannibal's tactical brilliance. The historian Livy wrote that Hannibal possessed intelligence to perceive what ought to be done, courage to undertake hazardous enterprises, and skill to execute them. His innovative use of combined arms, integrating infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, created a tactical flexibility that repeatedly outmaneuvered larger Roman forces. Hannibal's strategic vision extended beyond individual battles. His plan to open a northern front and turn Rome's Italian allies against them nearly succeeded. After Cannae, major cities including Capua and Syracuse joined his cause. For nearly 15 years, Hannibal operated on Italian soil, never losing a major battle, subsisting through his tactical genius and diplomatic skills. Modern military academies still study Hannibal's campaigns. His influence on military strategy is immeasurable. From Napoleon's Alpine crossing to Patton's tank warfare, commanders have drawn inspiration from the African general who dared to take elephants across mountains to challenge an empire. On March 28, 1900, in the royal court at Kumasi, British Governor Frederick Hodgson committed one of the most catastrophic cultural blunders in colonial history. Standing before the assembled Ashanti chiefs, he demanded that they surrender the golden stool, the sacred throne that embodied the very soul of the Ashanti nation. The chiefs listened in stunned silence. The golden stool wasn't merely a symbol of political power, it was the spiritual heart of their people, containing what they believed to be the souls of all Ashanti ancestors. Demanding it was like asking Christians to surrender the cross or Muslims to give up the Kaaba. The chiefs filed out in silence, but their silence masked preparation for war. In a secret meeting that night, they debated how to respond to this unprecedented insult. Some counseled caution. arguing that British military superiority made resistance futile. Then Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu, rose to speak. Her words, preserved in oral tradition, would become legendary. Now I see that you are afraid to go forward and fight for our king. If you, the chiefs of Ashanti, are going to behave like cowards and not fight, you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments. To punctuate her point, she grabbed a rifle and fired it before the assembled men. The challenge was unmistakable. If the male chiefs lacked courage, the women would fight. This wasn't empty rhetoric. As Queen Mother, Ya Asantewa held genuine political and military authority within the Ashanti matrilineal system. She was responsible for selecting kings, controlling royal regalia, and serving as the constitutional guardian of the golden stool itself. Her challenge forced the chiefs to choose between their traditional gender roles and their political survival. They chose her as their military commander. What followed was the War of the Golden Stool, a 6-month campaign that became the largest African uprising against British colonial rule. Ya Asantewa commanded 5,000 warriors who laid siege to the British fort at Kumasi, trapping Governor Hodgson and his garrison in what colonial documents describe as desperate circumstances. The siege tactics employed by Ya Asantewa's forces demonstrated sophisticated military planning. Rather than launching futile frontal assaults against British fortifications, her commanders established a ring of entrenchments that cut off supplies and communications. They employed guerrilla tactics, striking at British patrol units and supply convoys while avoiding direct confrontation with concentrated firepower. For months, the British were trapped. Relief columns sent from the coast faced constant harassment from Ashanti forces who had mastered the art of fighting on their home terrain. The colonial administration had to deploy 1,400 additional troops, a massive commitment, to break the siege and suppress the uprising. Even in defeat, Ya Asantewa achieved a strategic victory. The British, recognizing the intensity of Ashanti resistance, formally guaranteed that the Golden Stool would never again be demanded or molested by colonial authorities. The spiritual heart of the Ashanti nation remained intact. In the 16th century, while European powers were just beginning to establish overseas colonies, an African military genius was conducting campaigns that would reshape the entire Horn of Africa. Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known to his enemies as Grogn, the left-handed, and to his followers as Sahib al-Fath, the conqueror, achieved what seemed impossible, bringing the ancient Christian empire of Ethiopia to the brink of extinction. From his base in the Adal Sultanate, Ahmad assembled a revolutionary military force that combined traditional African warfare with cutting-edge Ottoman technology. His army included Somali, Harari, and Afar warriors armed with Portuguese and Ottoman firearms, matchlock muskets and cannons that could devastate traditional Ethiopian forces equipped with spears and swords. The campaign that followed, recorded in detail by his chronicler, Shihab al-Din Ahmad ibn Abd al-Qadir, in the Futuh al-Habasha, Conquest of Ethiopia, reads like something from legend. Between 1529 and 1543, Ahmad's forces conquered virtually the entire Ethiopian empire, forcing Emperor Lebna Dengel to flee to remote mountain strongholds. Ahmad's military genius lay in understanding that conquest required more than battlefield victories. His forces systematically destroyed the infrastructure of Christian Ethiopia, burning churches, monasteries, and administrative centers while establishing Islamic governance and encouraging religious conversion. Archaeological evidence shows that during his campaigns, an estimated 90% of Ethiopian territory came under his control. The Battle of Shimbra Kure in 1529 demonstrated Ahmad's tactical innovation. Facing a much larger Ethiopian army, his forces used firearms to create panic among enemy troops who had never encountered gunpowder weapons. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. Traditional Ethiopian cavalry charges became suicide missions against disciplined formations of musketeers. Ahmad's campaigns reached their climax with the capture of Aksum, the holiest city of Ethiopian Christianity. There, he ordered the destruction of the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion, where Ethiopian emperors had been crowned for centuries. It was a symbolic act meant to demonstrate that the old order was finished forever. But Ahmad's success ultimately brought about his downfall. The complete collapse of Ethiopian resistance alarmed the Portuguese, who saw their potential Red Sea trade routes threatened by Ottoman-backed Islamic expansion. In 1541, a Portuguese force under Cristóvão da Gama landed at Massawa with 400 musketeers and modern artillery. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Huayna Daga in 1543. Despite his tactical brilliance, Ahmad was killed by a Portuguese musketeer who charged alone into Muslim lines. With his death, the Islamic empire he had built collapsed almost overnight, and Ethiopian Christianity was restored. Ahmad's legacy persisted long after his death. Ethiopian chronicles claim his invasions were so traumatic that every Christian Highlander still hears tales of Grogn in his childhood. Modern historians trace the roots of Ethiopian-Somali conflict to the deep suspicions and fears generated by his campaigns. In the 1880s, as European powers were carving up Africa during the scramble for Africa, one man stood virtually alone against the tide of colonialism. Samori Touré, a Muslim trader turned emperor, built the Wassoulou Empire across West Africa and fought the French colonial machine for 16 years in what became one of the most sustained resistance movements in African history. Born around 1830 in present-day Guinea, Samori began as a trader before circumstances forced him into military leadership. When his mother was captured in a slave raid, he joined the army of her captor to secure her release. His intelligence and military skill rapidly elevated him through the ranks until he was commanding his own forces. By the 1870s, Samori had revolutionized West African warfare. Unlike traditional cavalry-based armies, his forces were built around disciplined infantry units armed with modern rifles. He established arms factories and maintained a sophisticated intelligence network of traders who reported on French movements and local political situations. The Wassoulou Empire at its height controlled territory spanning parts of present-day Guinea, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Burkina Faso. Samori's administrative genius matched his military skills. He created a functioning state with standardized currency, trade regulations, and judicial systems that respected both Islamic and traditional African law. When French colonial forces began pushing eastward from Senegal, they met unexpected resistance. The French had expected to defeat scattered tribal forces with superior technology. Instead, they faced a unified empire with modern weapons, disciplined troops, and brilliant tactical leadership. Samori's military innovations forced the French to completely rethink their colonial strategy. He pioneered scorched earth tactics, retreating east while destroying everything of value, forcing French forces to operate in devastated territory without local supplies. His mobile warfare tactics, rapid cavalry raids followed by infantry attacks, repeatedly outmaneuvered slower French columns. The French military grudgingly acknowledged his capabilities. After the Battle of Dabadougou, where Samori's forces inflicted heavy casualties on a French expeditionary force, colonial reports described him as the most dangerous antagonist Europeans had to deal with in West Africa. For over a decade, the Mandingo Wars raged across West Africa. Samori's forces fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, holding off French advances from the north and west while conquering new territory to the east and south. His strategic vision was breathtaking. He was essentially fighting a mobile campaign across an area the size of Western Europe. The end came not through military defeat, but through resource exhaustion. Cut off from coastal arms suppliers and facing enemies on all sides, Samori was finally captured in 1898. The French, recognizing his capabilities even in defeat, exiled him to Gabon rather than executing him. Samari's great-grandson, Ahmed Sékou Touré, would become Guinea's first president and lead the only West African colony to vote for immediate independence from France in 1958, fulfilling his ancestors' dream of African freedom. These 7 commanders didn't just fight individual battles. They revolutionized military strategy, built transcontinental empires, and defended African independence against overwhelming odds. Their innovations in tactics, technology, and leadership influenced warfare far beyond the African continent. Shaka's combined arms tactics and disciplined training methods were studied by European military academies. Hannibal's strategic concepts are still taught at West Point and Sandhurst. Queen Amina's economic warfare, using trade control to fund military expansion, became a model replicated across the medieval world. Yet their stories have been systematically erased from mainstream historical narratives. Why? Because acknowledging African military genius contradicts colonial-era myths about African primitiveness that justified European domination. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. African metallurgy was producing superior steel when Europe was still in the Bronze Age. African kingdoms were conducting transcontinental diplomacy when European states were provincial city-states. African military innovations were shaping global warfare when European armies were crude feudal militias. These warriors represent more than military history. They embody African innovation, resistance, and excellence. Their legacies remind us that Africa has always been a continent of empires, not tribes, of genius, not barbarism, of resistance, not submission. Their stories matter because they tell the truth about African capability and achievement. They matter because they restore pride to communities whose histories were stolen. And they matter because understanding the past is essential for building a future where all people's contributions to human civilization are recognized and celebrated. The next time someone suggests that Africa lacks military tradition, remember Hannibal crossing the Alps. When they claim African states were primitive, think of Queen Amina's 20,000-soldier army. When they argue that Africans never resisted colonialism, recall Ya Asantewa firing her rifle before the Ashanti chiefs. These weren't just warriors, they were world changers, and their time to be remembered has finally come. What's your favorite story from these incredible African warriors? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from African history that will change how you see the world.